Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to cover what exactly HTTP requests are, and why having too many of them can really be a factor in slowing down your page loading times. Now, HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and it's what takes place when someone types in your URL into their browser and pings your server to request a file, like a page from your website. And it's what takes place when the server sends them that requested file. Thing is, the initial HTTP request doesn't end there. An HTTP request takes place for all the files needed to create the web page. The HTML file, the JavaScript and the CSS files, image files, Flash content, everything. Each of these components is only delivered from the server by way of an HTTP request. And 80% of the visitor's response time takes place here, as all of the requests for files are being submitted to the server, and as the server is receiving those requests and sending the files that have been requested. And generally speaking, for mobile users, this can be very frustrating with slow load times, since often enough the user has to wait until all of the assets are fully downloaded before the page is rendered in their browser. And the last thing you want is a frustrated visitor. Most polling data on the subject indicates that people expect a website to load in less than 2 seconds. And if a website takes more than 3 seconds to load, then a whopping 40%, nearly half of all users, will jump ship and abandon. So obviously this is no small issue. And one of the most effective ways you can speed up your site's load time is to reduce the number of HTTP requests that are required to render your site. Now keep in mind that there's no special number here. There's no optimal number of HTTP requests to be sending for any given site. In fact, there are plenty of very large sites out there that require many files to render. And this includes high-definition images, which are generally the bulkiest component. And so of course, finding ways to optimize and reduce the file sizes of those components, such as high-def images, is obviously one of the first topics you need to explore when optimizing your site. But also, you shouldn't ignore this issue of how many HTTP requests are needed, because this is also something that you can optimize. And it can have a dramatic effect on how fast your website's pages are able to load for the end user. So let's jump right in and look at a real case here. After running our site on SEO Site Checkup, we can see that we've got a warning here for having too many HTTP requests. Now the great part about this test is it gives you a snapshot here of where your general issues might be. Now, of course, again, every website is going to be different. So if you have loads and loads of images, then that might be an area to look into optimizing, which I'll address in a second here. But in this particular case, with 19 JavaScript files, and I can click on this to see what and where they are located, I might have a think about what I can do here. And by the way, having many JavaScript files, for instance, it's not a crime in and of itself. In fact, if you're using WordPress, for instance, and you have a lot of plugins, then you're probably going to see a high number of files here. But when it comes to both CSS and JavaScript files, it's definitely worth considering if you should combine them into one file called concatenating, as well as minify them. Now, I go into much more detail on how to do that in our video on how to optimize your page size. But basically, first you should have a quick think about whether or not it's worth it. For instance, let's say that in these 19 JavaScript files, only one of them is actually used for my main page. Maybe all the others are only used on specific pages within my website that don't get that much traffic anyway. Well, in that case, then it wouldn't make much sense to concatenate them, since then I'd be creating a much larger file that takes much longer to download for no real reason. I'd be having the end user download all those JavaScript functions that they're not going to need for most pages of my site. So in that case, it wouldn't make much sense. On the other hand, and for a lot of cases, you might find that most of the pages on your website call up the same JavaScript files. Let's say that 12 of these files are necessary for every page on my site. Then in that case, it would make sense for me to combine them into one JavaScript file. Just cut and paste the contents into one file, then point the HTML to that JavaScript file. And congratulations, you've just killed the need for 11 HTTP requests. And again, there's much more on this in our video on how to optimize page size. But furthermore, by minifying the script, you can make the load even lighter and thus make your page load even faster. And the same exact thing goes for your external CSS style sheets. Instead of loading up 5 different sheets every time, if you concatenate or combine them into one, and then point your HTML to it, you can save 4 HTTP requests, and this is not nothing. And now let's quickly talk about HTTP requests for images. This is an issue for many websites, so let's go over some ways that we can optimize this here. One trick is to make use of CSS Sprites. Essentially, this is combining several images into one and using CSS to call it up, thus eliminating the multiple HTTP requests that they would normally require. But before you go running off and putting all your images into sprites, hang on. There's a bit more to it than that and more to consider. First of all, they're not ideal for every situation. Very broadly speaking, using sprites is really best for background images or for buttons and logos, etc. For instance, let's say we have 4 menu items on our site, each with a different image. Instead of 4 HTTP requests to bring in these 4 images, we can create a sprite with all 4 images, split them into a 4-column grid, and then offset the index of each one to tell the browser where to place it. This way, it takes just one HTTP request to conjure the contents of the one sprite sheet. Or same goes if you have a button, let's say, that actually contains 3 images. One image is for its primary state, another when the user hovers their mouse over it, and a third when it's clicked. That's 3 HTTP requests required for this one button. Plus, at times, a user may experience that the hover image is not appearing if it hasn't been loaded yet. On the other hand, by using a sprite, that's not going to happen, since just one HTTP request will pull in all 3 images within the sprite. Or let's say that your website uses 3 different background images on 3 different pages. You can actually combine all 3 images into one sprite, saved as a single image file. Then in your CSS, you can create a general class that applies to all 3, like to repeat or not to repeat. Then create 3 different classes, one for each image, and use the height and position parameters to determine which part of that one combined image you want to use for the background. Then in your HTML, by applying one of these 3 classes to a page, you can then set the background to be, technically speaking, one part out of 3 of that combined image. And again, this requires only one HTTP request for the server to send this combined image to the end user's browser, and then it's cached and faster to upload. So hopefully you understand the concept. Using sprites is an old trick, but it can still be very useful in some cases, reducing your HTTP requests and load time. That said, there are many cases where you definitely do not want to use these sprites. Obviously not in cases where you want users to be able to download a single image. If using a sprite, they'll only have the option to download the entire sprite as a single image. You also want to avoid sprites in cases where the image sizes vary quite a bit. This will tend to create a very large sprite and increase the file sizes of the images, resulting in, yeah, sure, maybe just one HTTP request to get the sprite, but overall a much larger file size than it would have originally. So you always have to weigh the balance between the number of HTTP requests you're making and the size of the files that you need to be sent by your server. Now, another method for reducing HTTP requests when it comes to images is to use data URIs to embed images into your HTML or CSS, instead of having a link to an external image source, which would require another HTTP request to send for and to get it. With data URIs, it basically works like this. Let's say you have this image, which of course is actually composed of code. Just to illustrate the general idea here, I'll open up this image in Notepad, which by default is ANSI encoded here. Now with data URIs, you're encoding this as ASCII or as a base 64 string, which would look more like this. And in your HTML, instead of linking to the external image in your images folder on your server, you'd be embedding that string of code directly into your HTML. So let's say that you have 10 image links in your HTML, and you replace those with data URIs. Your HTML code is going to be larger, of course, but in this case, just one HTTP request is needed to fetch all that content from the server. And on that note, a good thing to know is that most web browsers are configured to only make a certain number of HTTP connections to a server at the same time. Usually this is limited to 2 connections. So by embedding data URIs and keeping that data inline, the other available HTTP connection can be freed up to download other assets for that site. Now the format for embedding images as data URIs is this. And to get that string of code, you can Google data URI generator and find plenty of free options. Just upload your image and generate the string of code. Copy and paste into your HTML. But again, before you go running off and encoding all of your images with this newfangled trick, let's quickly talk about some of the pros and cons, when it's best to use them and when it doesn't make much sense. Generally, you're always going to want to weigh the pros of less HTTP requests against the cons of an increase in file size of your HTML or CSS and other factors. You should note that base 64 encoding will usually add up to about 30% more file size compared to its binary version. That said, if you're utilizing gzip compression, which you absolutely should be doing anyway, then base 64 will only end up adding about 2 to 3% an increase in size. Now, if you're going to be replacing an image often enough, then of course you might not want to go through the hassle of encoding it as a search string and replacing it in your HTML every time you want to update it. Also, it should be noted that data URIs are very widely supported by browsers, except for Internet Explorer versions 5 through 7. So in my case, with all of the websites that I run, I check out my analytics regularly, and very, very rarely do I see users with those old versions of the IE browser. So personally, I just let this slide. But depending on your traffic, you can make your own determination about that. If it's a concern for you, then I'd recommend only using data URIs on images that don't really matter if they don't show up. Or you can make an Internet Explorer specific style sheet and have links to the external images there. And by the way, I've only been talking about using data URIs for images here, but for the record, they can actually be used for anything. But for now, let's just keep this limited to images, where they are generally applied to. In fact, they are generally only applied to very small images, like a few kilobytes or less, for images of symbols, icons, and so on. This is because one disadvantage of using data URIs is that they're not cached by the browser. So every time a page is loaded, the browser has to decode that string again in order to render the image. But let's say that you have a website with 100 small icons, each with a very small file size. If you have links to those icons in an external folder on your server, then that's 100 HTTP requests, which takes time. So you'd have to weigh that against having a larger HTML file, but one that contains encoded icons. And perhaps the extra time it takes to download that page is in the end much faster thanks to requiring 99 less HTTP requests. You can also embed these data URIs in your cascading style sheets, not just in your HTML. But again, you probably want to limit this to small image files only. If you apply it to a large image, it will take longer for the user to download that style sheet into their browser. And in the meantime, unless you have two separate style sheets that is, one for your regular style definitions and another one containing your data URI images, then all the other assets that are being downloaded to render the page will have to go without any style element until that data URI image has been downloaded. And when it comes to mobile browsers, the pros and cons of data URIs share a very delicate balance. On the one hand, mobile browsers tend to be a bit slow in decoding these data URIs. Furthermore, mobile browsers also tend to have limits on the overall size of files being cached. Now, these limits are likely trending to be larger, but it's still something to be aware of. And then, however, on the flip side, HTTP access over cell networks usually have a high latency per HTTP request and HTTP response. So in that way, embedding the code string of data URIs into HTML or CSS to save on the number of HTTP requests can be a very, very good thing on mobile browsers, so long as the new file size of that HTML or CSS doesn't outweigh the performance benefits. So it's true across the board, obviously, but again, especially with mobile browsers, this battle between pros and cons is even more contested. So if you want to give this a go and try it out, it's highly, highly recommended that you do some testing in a mobile browser environment and make sure that you're not losing more than you're gaining. And lastly, one more thing to consider, especially if your website is getting a good deal of international traffic, is to use a CDN or content delivery network. Not saying it's not worth it if most of your traffic is in your local country, but it will make an even bigger difference globally. Now, without a CDN, let's say that my server is located in Dallas. So someone from New York hops onto my website and all that content, the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript files, images, everything, all of that has to travel from Dallas to New York, typically through two open HTTP connections on the user's browser. So there's a bit of a logjam, and let's say this takes 5 seconds. That's not good. But if I'm using a CDN, I'm using a network of servers to host my content, and the network will send the data from the closest server to the user. So my guy in New York, he types my URL into his browser, and those files are coming from a server in upstate New York, which is much, much closer to him. And to go one further, it's even possible to use more than one CDN, so that in this case, my guy can get the content delivered to him from 2 nearby servers, and in that case, over 4 HTTP connections instead of 2. So now all those assets come in 1 second instead of 5, lightning fast. And there you go. That's what HTTP requests are in a nutshell, and some tips and tricks on how to reduce them to make your website load as fast as possible. Feel free to check out our other videos so you can keep fine-tuning and getting the most out of your SEO. And click subscribe to stay updated with new tips and tricks to get you to the top of the search engine results pages.